Why bother making a new intro when you can just repurpose an old one? Let the wind blow, let the grass grow. Let the bees make honey, let the poor find money. Take away their sorrow and give them sunshine tomorrow. Welcome back again. Let's continue our celebration of 1967 to coincide with the anniversary of Smiley Smile by talking about what is perhaps the definitive 1967 Beach Boys release, Sunshine Tomorrow, a 2-CD set and a very special look at both Wild Honey and Smiley Smile, along with some other surprises too. This is a really fun set, and I've talked about it so much on this channel, but I've never actually done a deep dive look into it before, and I really need to do that. So I kind of did 1967 backwards. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you might have seen my live Sunshine video where I deep dive into the digital box set that has multiple 1967 concerts, most notably the two in Hawaii. And just recently, I talked about Sunshine Tomorrow 2, which is kind of live, or I shouldn't say live, I should say studio material there. This is live, that's studio. Not that there aren't things that are live in studio, but nonetheless, two great digital supplements to a really fun CD set. 1967 Sunshine Tomorrow kind of makes an attempt to condense a box set, a bigger set, down onto just 2 CDs, and for the most part it succeeds. Yeah, there are a few moments that go kind of from place to place and don't really seem to belong, but for the most part it's a solid set and a must-have for any Beach Boys collection. So we'll actually start, we'll take a look at the booklet first. The booklet has a very nice write-up by Howie Edelson talking about the aftermath of the Beach Boys' Smile. The Beach Boys didn't just give up making music after Smile. They didn't go and abandon everything they'd worked on. Indeed, both Smiley Smile and Wild Honey have Smile DNA running through them. How the group had a lot of good ideas, going kind of back to their roots, back to basics, figuring on trends that would come later for other rock and roll musicians, you know, sticking with keeping it simple, doing kind of an R&B approach. Howie Edelson, of course, today is criticized very heavily for some of the mastering and some of the sequencing and things on other projects he's worked on, but I think this set's really quite good. I don't know what all his role was besides just writing the liner notes. I know some people criticize him, saying he isn't really a Beach Boys person. Hey, who knows, right? I think he does a fine job. Let the motorcycle go by there, and we get a very detailed track list that talks about when things were recorded, what's previously unreleased, and so on. There are some notes from Mark Linnett and Alan Boyd regarding mixes as well. Very important to this set because, as we'll talk about in a moment, this was the first time Wild Honey was released on stereo in its entirety. So that's a very impressive thing. And so making a big deal about the mixing and the production of these tracks, certainly very useful. But some really nice liner notes. And I guess you'd say kind of an alternate write-up of the original Wild Honey liner notes there. You can see an original here. You know, talking about things like the letter. The letter, which we'll get to later on, was considered for Wild Honey, but ultimately not used. And we have 2 discs. The first disc is the remaster of Wild Honey, along with a few other special things like Wild Honey sessions and live tracks. A lot of fun there. And then the second disc is the unreleased Laid in Hawaii live album, released in its entirety for the first time, along with some Smiley Smile sessions, some 1967 live material, and a few kind of odds and ends that didn't really fit with Wild Honey or with Smiley Smile, so they just kind of put them there, and we'll get to those, of course, very, very soon. So when it comes to box sets, the Beach Boys released a giant jumbo box set back in 2013 to coincide with the 50th anniversary celebration. That was made in California. I have a giant video on Made in California. That was a lot of fun to make. I'm very proud of that video. But the point of it is there's a lot of stuff on Made in California. But despite that, it wasn't really well received by fans. And I don't doubt that tepid reaction to this box set made a lot of executives say like, oh, you know, would another Beach Boys big, you know, multi-CD box set be worth it? Maybe not. You know, the 30th anniversary set had performed really well, but this one met with a lot of criticism for sort of the mixing, you know, using stereo, mono, old stereo, new stereo, that kind of thing, and kind of blending it all together. And also for skipping big sections of the group's history and kind of just picking and choosing, focusing really heavily on one area, not much on the other. There's a lot of cool stuff on Made in California and stuff that remains unique to it, but at the same time, there are certain disappointing aspects. So no doubt they didn't want to repeat that debacle with Sunshine Tomorrow. Now, interestingly, in the interim, we did have a box set of sorts. I've talked about this one on this channel too. Keep an Eye on Summer, which was a fully digital box set celebrating 1964. And it was well received by fans. I mean, it's not going to break any sales records or anything because it's just a couple of clicks of your mouse and a credit card payment, and there you go. But nonetheless, this probably would have worked as a physical set, I think, if they'd thrown a few more things in there and shuffled a few things around. But Keep an Eye on Summer is really fun. And for the Beach Boys fans who don't buy digital sets, I'm going to say if you at least buy that one, I think you'll be satisfied with it. But Sunshine Tomorrow is kind of an experiment. Okay, you know, can we kind of recoup the losses from the last physical box set, or should everything from now on just be digital? Indeed, the two digital follow-ups were no doubt things that were considered for this CD, and they just kind of vetoed them. Maybe not exactly what the audience wants. I get that. And both of these, while not essential, are certainly interesting listens and interesting things to have. So let's go ahead. We'll start on disc 1 of 1967, Sunshine Tomorrow. It actually opens with the first, almost, full stereo remastering and remixing of the Wild Honey album. So, of course, here's an original Wild Honey record. They did re-release it on vinyl to coincide with this digital release, but I will say I framed my vinyl copy. It hangs up in my dining room. I never listened to it. But this CD, quite good stuff. So we'd seen a few mixes of Wild Honey songs earlier, notably in the early 2000s, Let the Wind Blow was remixed for stereo and so on. But having a full stereo version for the first time is a pretty exciting thing. Now, around the time of the 50th anniversary, a lot of the Beach Boys releases were remixed to stereo or were issued on CD in special mono and stereo, kind of twofers, that sort of thing. I shouldn't say twofer because there's only one disc, but two alternate versions of the same album, first mono then stereo. The prices on those were exorbitant. I don't have very many of them. And Wild Honey was not included in that, much to the surprise of many fans, especially because on Made in California, we saw new 2012 stereo mixes of Wild Honey, Darlin', and Country Air. So they obviously were working on them at that time, but maybe somewhere along the line somebody said, you know what, we don't really need a Wild Honey remix right now. No one's going to pay to hear the whole thing in stereo, whatever, because it didn't get that release like Smiley Smile did, for example. It got a full stereo remastering in 2012. So Wild Honey in full stereo, or almost full stereo, as we'll get to in a second, was a brand new thing and not something that was included in that. So let's go ahead and talk about the Wild Honey aspect of things. I'm not going to actually review the Wild Honey album here because Wild Honey needs kind of its own video, and someday I will do one where I break it down song by song and that kind of thing. So I don't want to sit here and go through every single Wild Honey song and talk about remixes and things like that. Giggins did a great video when this CD was released where he kind of breaks down the musical differences of most or almost all of the songs. I don't really want to do that here, but I will say this release was what made me a Wild Honey fan. Getting into the Beach Boys in the 2000s and early 2010s as a teenager and in my very early 20s, Wild Honey was never an album I listened to very much, but then when this release came out, when I was in kind of my mid-20s, I really liked it, and I really gravitated towards those recordings. And indeed, the Sounds of Summer box set from a couple of years ago actually reused several of the stereo mixes here because they were so well done. So if you're not really a Wild Honey fan, I still recommend checking this out because I think it will make you one. These sound amazing. Darlin' and Wild Honey have been remixed for stereo since to coincide with that Sounds of Summer set, but honestly these versions I think are better. This was definitely a labor of love, someone who really liked and really appreciated the album there. The exception to the rule though, because as I've said before, it's not technically a stereo mix, it's an almost full stereo mix, is Mama Says, the a cappella finale to the Wild Honey album. The liner notes are very honest, and they specify that there were missing elements that they needed to make a full stereo remix, and it does say, even on the back, there's an asterisk that says original mono. So, as it's an a cappella, it's not as big a deal, but I'm glad they were honest. When the Beach Boys Today was remixed to stereo, Bull Session with Big Daddy, everyone's least favorite Beach Boys spoken word track, was not remixed to stereo, but on the label it still said all tracks in stereo, that kind of thing. And some Beach Boys fans were a bit irritated, probably not for the actual fact that the track was in mono and not stereo, but just that they weren't honest about it. But here they are, they say Mama Says is in mono. The liner notes also say there are elements of How She Boogalooed It, the penultimate track, that are still in mono, notably the organ parts. I will say it's not really noticeable, but it does help to explain why on the digital set they do kind of a weird partial instrumental, partial vocal sort of mix, and it sounds, you know, kind of like something that they were working on but weren't quite sure what to do with. It wouldn't surprise me if the availability of some of these elements had a lot to do with that. But we start off with a mostly full stereo remix of Wild Honey, very impressive and a lot of fun. Then we get into Wild Honey Sessions. These were things recorded in September, October, November of 1967 for the Wild Honey album. Something we've talked about on this channel before is Lonely Days, which made its debut here on Hawthorne, California. Lonely Days, not exactly a finished song, but certainly getting to that point, you know, something that they have to do a little bit more work on first. But here a longer version appears. I would say probably the definitive version of it. There is a longer version on the digital set, as I talked about, but that has more like sessions and backing instrumental kind of stuff. This is the closest Lonely Days is to actually being a fully finished, realized song, that sort of thing. We have an early version of Cool, Cool Water, which is kind of on its way from the Smile era to the Sunflower era. It's kind of their step in that progression. There are a lot of mixes of Cool, Cool Water out there. As with Time to Get Alone, we get a very early version. Time to Get Alone would eventually be released on the 2020 album, but it was started here during Wild Honey. Here's kind of an early alternate take. There are a few differences. It's nothing major if you haven't heard it. It's probably not a big deal, but it's pretty interesting stuff. Then we have Can't Wait Too Long, also known as Been Way Too Long. One of those things the Beach Boys worked on, never actually finished. Here we get a mostly kind of instrumental demo kind of job. Nothing major, again. One that focuses mostly on the instrumentation and less on the vocals. We have an alternate take of I'd Love Just Once to See You from Wild Honey. This is kind of a goofy alternate take. You can tell the group's just kind of horsing around and having fun with it. And of course that song is a very heavily sexualized song, especially at the end, so maybe they were just having a laugh with it. I kind of like that they went with the more normal version for the Wild Honey album. We get I Was Made to Love Her, both a vocal insert and also an extended version of that. The extended version was released on the Beach Boys' Rarities album. I've talked all about that. And then the vocal insert session is something new. Really the only difference between the long version and the one on the Wild Honey album is the a cappella section near the ending. All through thick and thin, my love just won't end, that sort of thing. And so it's nice to have it here on CD. A lot of people who hunted down Beach Boys Rarities in the 2000s and 2010s wanted it because up until this point, that was only released on that one particular record. So it's good to have it again here. We have two kind of short backing tracks, Hide Go Seek, which is, I guess, a relative of some kind to Teeter Totter Love from the big version of Smile. Here's the 2 LP set. Teeter Totter Love is on the big CD set. And we also get Honey Get Home, another just kind of short backing track. They're really catchy and really fun instrumentals. I don't know that they were really part of anything, that sort of thing, but it's interesting to hear them. We get a Wild Honey session tape plus a track with backing vocals. We'd heard the Wild Honey backing track way back in the 60s with stacco tracks. Now it's nice to hear it remixed with the backing vocals in it, plus some session stuff. This Wild Honey session material, the longest track or song on the entire CD set. So that's kind of nice. Definitely a big focus. We get something very similar with Aren't You Glad? We get some sessions, and then we also get the instrumental backing track, this time with no vocals. Really nice. Aren't You Glad is one of those things that kind of pops up here and there throughout the Beach Boys' history. It's on the Live in London album. It was on the Sounds of Summer set that came out a couple years ago. Nice to have the instrumental of it here. I think this set will go one better by releasing an exclusive stereo, single, like alternate version. A Thing or Two, the title of the Beach Boys online newsletter, that song, which gave it that name. We get a short backing track fragment. You can kind of hear a little bit of talking in the background at different points. Not sure if that's part of the backing vocals or maybe it's like a session take, but we only get about a minute fragment, nothing major there. Darlin', we get the session and also the backing track as well. And the backing track for Darlin' we'd already heard before too. Interestingly, as I said in the last video, they didn't opt to do much with the vocals of Darlin'. We didn't get like an a cappella or anything unusual like that. Kind of surprised me. At our last of our Wild Honey sessions, Let the Wind Blow, we get the track and the backing vocals. Let the Wind Blow was one of, if not the very first, Wild Honey song to be remixed and widely released in stereo. So it makes sense that they'd have a lot of stuff to work with for that. It's probably an easier task. But yeah, here we get a nice little session thing, and there'd be even more Let the Wind Blow sessions to follow up here. So definitely, a really fun song, and of course the one that actually gives this CD set its name. Let the Bees Make Honey, all that stuff. You saw my reused intro, you know what I'm talking about. And lastly, for disc 1, we have Wild Honey Live. And there's actually not a whole lot to talk about here because I've already gone over the giant digital, supplementary release there. And it's much the same kind of stuff here. Wild Honey, Country Air, and How She Boogalooed It, all live in Detroit in November of 1967. These are interesting, as it was kind of the first Wild Honey show. The group's kind of seeing which songs they can keep and which ones they probably shouldn't put in the live set, that kind of thing. Interestingly, they did not use Darlin' from this concert. They used the Pittsburgh take instead. There's really nothing wrong with the Detroit take. I'm assuming that they just wanted to mix it up a little bit, have a few songs from different locations, that sort of thing. So, really interesting stuff. Country Air, I'm not sure if it's ever been done live again. How She Boogalooed It, I'm sure it hasn't. Of course, Darlin' and even Wild Honey are fairly regular concert staples. So it's interesting to hear them in kind of the early stage. Not sure why they couldn't have just put the entire Detroit show or something like that, maybe a space constraint, but interesting stuff nonetheless. Could see some very early bits, and there's a little bit of editing when it was moved here, and it's just the actual concert tape versus for a CD. They sometimes cut things up a little bit differently. And we get something that remains unique to this set and is actually pretty interesting in its own right. Aren't You Glad? Live in 1970. The booklet does not specify when or where in 1970. The consensus online seems to be the Big Sur Festival. The group had an album appearance there. They did Wouldn't It Be Nice? There was like a special live album released. I don't actually have that record. I need to track it down. But this is interesting to have as another piece of that. I know there's bootlegs that float around with that Big Sur Festival 1970 show, but some pretty interesting material nonetheless. And Aren't You Glad? Always fun to hear live. Of course, it was on Live in London. Here, they do a little bit of lyrical switching up, that kind of thing, but the song turns out pretty good. I should add that I don't have any concrete proof it was from the Big Sur show. In my Fillmore East video, I noted that a lot of people thought the performance on Feel Flows of It's About Time was taken from the Fillmore East, but that was later redacted and replaced with Central Park. So it's quite possible it's from somewhere else, but the Big Sur show seems like a safe bet. In the finished CD1, we have Mama Says, some session takes, all played for laughs. If you had the Big Smile set, you might have heard things like the Heroes and Villains Do-A-Lot take, which is exactly like Mama Says, except with some light instrumental accompaniment. But here they're playing Mama Says, and joking around, rehearsing the poof at the end and all that kind of stuff. Really fun, and a good way, I think, to end CD number 1. So let's hold it there, folks, and then next time we can swing around to take a look at disc number 2, and we'll talk about Late in Hawaii, Smiley Smile, and a few odds and ends. If you have thoughts on 2017's Sunshine Tomorrow, please comment them below, and we'll see you next time. Go out there and get a breath of country air. Thank you.